Chapter 1 of The Night Side of Nature, or Ghosts and Ghost Seers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maria Luisa Ruiz, Eugene, Oregon. The Night Side of Nature, or Ghosts and Ghost Seers, by Catherine Crowe. Chapter 1. Introduction. Know ye not that ye are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwelleth in you? 1 Corinthians 3:16. Most persons are aware that the Greeks and Romans entertained certain notions regarding the state of the soul, or the immortal part of man, after the death of the body, which have been generally held to be purely mythological. Many of them doubtless are so, and of these I am not about to treat. But among their conceptions there are some which, as they coincide with the opinions of many of the most enlightened persons of the present age, it may be desirable to consider more closely. I allude here particularly to their belief in the tripartite kingdom of the dead. According to this system, there were the Elysian fields, a region in which a certain sort of happiness was enjoyed, and Tartarus, the place of punishment for the wicked, each of which was comparatively but thinly inhabited. But there was also a mid-region peopled with innumerable hosts of wandering and mournful spirits, who, although undergoing no torments, are represented as incessantly bewailing their condition, pining for the life they once enjoyed in the body, longing after the things of the earth, and occupying themselves with the same pursuits and objects as had formerly constituted their business or their pleasure. Old habits are still dear to them, and they cannot snap the link that binds them to the earth. Now, although we cannot believe in the existence of Carun, the three-headed dog, or Alecto, the serpent-haired fury, it may be worthwhile to consider whether the persuasion of the ancients with regard to that which concerns us all so nearly, namely, the destiny that awaits us when we have shaken off this mortal coil, may not have some foundation in truth, whether it might not be a remnant of a tradition transmitted from the earliest inhabitants of the earth, wrested by observation from nature, if not communicated from a higher source, and also whether circumstances of constant recurrence in all ages and in all nations, frequently observed and recorded by persons utterly ignorant of classical lore and unacquainted, indeed, with the dogmas of any creed but their own, do not, as well as various passages in the Scriptures, afford a striking confirmation of this theory of a future life, while it, on the other hand, offers a natural and convenient explanation of their mystery. To minds which can admit nothing but what can be explained and demonstrated, an investigation of this sort must appear perfectly idle. For while on the one hand the most acute intellect or the most powerful logic can throw little light on the subject, it is at the same time, though I have a confident hope that this will not always be the case, equally irreducible within the present bounds of science. Meanwhile, experience, observation, and intuition must be our principal, if not our only, guides. Because in the 17th century credulity outran reason and discretion, the 18th century, by a natural reaction, threw itself into an opposite extreme. Whoever closely observes the signs of the times will be aware that another change is approaching. The contemptuous skepticism of the last age is yielding to a more humble spirit of inquiry, and there is a large class of persons, among the most enlightened of the present, who are beginning to believe that much which they had been taught to reject as fable has been in reality ill-understood truth. Somewhat of the mystery of our own being and of the mysteries that compass us about are beginning to loom upon us, as yet, it is true, but obscurely. And in the endeavor to follow out the clue they offer, we have but a feeble light to guide us. We must grope our way through the dim path before us, ever in danger of being led into error, while we may confidently reckon on being pursued by the shafts of ridicule, that weapon so easy to wield, so potent to the weak, so weak to the wise, which has delayed the births of so many truths, but never stifled one. The Pharisaical skepticism, which denies without investigation, is quite as perilous and much more contemptible than the blind credulity which accepts all that it is taught without inquiry. It is, indeed, but another form of ignorance assuming to be knowledge. And by investigation, I do not mean the hasty, captious, angry notice of an unwelcome fact that too frequently claims the right of pronouncing on a question, but the slow, modest, painstaking examination that is content to wait upon nature and humbly follow out her disclosures, however opposed to preconceived theories or mortifying to human pride. If scientific men could but comprehend how they discredit the science they really profess by their despotic arrogance and exclusive skepticism, they would surely, for the sake of that very science they love, affect more liberality and candor. This reflection, however, naturally suggests another, namely, do they really love science, or is it not too frequently with them but the means to an end? Were the love of science genuine, I suspect it would produce very different fruits to that which we see borne by the tree of knowledge as it flourishes at present. And this suspicion is exceedingly strengthened by the recollection that, among the numerous students and professors of science I have at different times encountered, the real worshippers and genuine lovers of it for its own sake have all been men of the most single, candid, unprejudiced, and inquiring minds, willing to listen to all new suggestions and investigate all new facts, not bold and self-sufficient, but humble and reverent suitors, aware of their own ignorance and unworthiness, and that they are yet but in the primer of nature's works. They do not permit themselves to pronounce upon her disclosures or set limits to her decrees. They are content to admit that things new and unsuspected may yet be true, that, their own knowledge of facts being extremely circumscribed, the systems attempted to be established on such uncertain data must needs be very imperfect and frequently altogether erroneous, and that it is therefore their duty, as it ought to be their pleasure, to welcome as a stranger every gleam of light that appears in the horizon, let it loom from whatever quarter it may. But alas, Poor science has few such lovers. Le boy Yuda sa cassette, I fear, are much more frequently the objects of attraction than her own fair face. The belief in a God and in the immortality of what we call the soul is common to all nations, but our own intellect does not enable us to form any conception of either one or the other. All the information we have on these subjects is comprised in such hints as the Scripture here and there give us. Whatever other conclusions we draw must be the result of observation and experience. Unless founded upon these, the opinion of the most learned theologian or the most profound student of science that ever lived is worth no more than that of any other person. They know nothing whatever about these mysteries, and all a priori reasoning on them is utterly valueless. The only way, therefore, of attaining any glimpses of the truth in an inquiry of this nature, where our intellect can serve us so little, is to enter on it with the conviction that, knowing nothing, we are not entitled to reject any evidence that may be offered to us till it has been thoroughly sifted and proved to be fallacious. That the facts presented to our notice appear to us absurd and altogether inconsistent with the notions our intellects would have enabled us to form should have no weight whatever in the investigation. Our intellects are no measure of God Almighty's designs. And I must say that I do think one of the most irreverent, dangerous, and sinful things man or woman can be guilty of is to reject with scorn and laughter any intimation which, however strangely it may strike upon our minds, and however adverse it may be to our opinions, may possibly be showing us the way to one of God's truths. Not knowing all the conditions and wanting so many links of the chain, it is impossible for us to pronounce on what is probable and consistent and what is not. And this being the case, I think the time is ripe for drawing attention to certain phenomena, which, under whatever aspect we may consider them, are beyond doubt exceedingly interesting and curious, while, if the view many persons are disposed to take of them be the correct one, they are much more than this. I wish also to make the English public acquainted with the ideas entertained on these subjects by a large proportion of German minds of the highest order. It is a distinctive characteristic of the thinkers of that country that, in the first place, they do think independently and courageously, and in the second, that they never shrink from promulgating the opinions they have been led to form, however new, strange, heterodox, or even absurd they may appear to others. They do not succumb, as people do in this country, to the fear of ridicule, nor are they in danger of the odium that here pursues those who deviate from established notions, and the consequence is that, though many fallacious theories and untenable propositions may be advanced, a great deal of new truth is struck out from the collision, and in the result, as must always be the case, what is true lives and is established, and what is false dies and is forgotten. But here in Britain, our critics and colleagues are in such haste to strangle and put down every new discovery that does not emanate from themselves, or which is not a fulfilling of the ideas of the day, but which, being somewhat opposed to them, promises to be troublesome from requiring new thought to render it intelligible, that one might be induced to suppose them divested of all confidence in this inviolable law, while the more important and the higher the results involved may be, the more angry they are with those who advocate them. They do not quarrel with a new metal or a new plant, and even a new comet or a new island stands a fair chance of being well received. The introduction of a planet appears, from late events, to be more difficult. While phrenology and mesmerism testify that any discovery tending to throw light on what most deeply concerns us, namely our own being, must be prepared to encounter a storm of angry persecution. And one of the evils of this hasty and precipitate opposition is that the passions and interests of the opposers become involved in the dispute. Instead of investigators, they become partisans. Having declared against it in the outset, it is important to their petty interests that the thing shall not be true, and they determine that it shall not if they can help it. Hence these hasty, angry investigations of new facts, and the triumph with which failures are recorded. And hence the willful overlooking of the axiom that 1,000 negatives cannot overthrow the evidence of one affirmative experiment. I always distrust those who have declared themselves strongly in the beginning of a controversy. Opinions which, however rashly avowed, may have been honest at first, may have been changed for many a long day before they are retracted. In the meantime, the march of truth is obstructed, and its triumph is delayed. Timid minds are alarmed. Those who dare not or cannot think for themselves are subdued. There is much needless suffering incurred and much good lost, but the truth goes quietly on its way and reaches the goal at last. With respect to the subjects I am here going to treat of, it is not simply the result of my own reflections and convictions that I am about to offer. On the contrary, I intend to fortify my position by the opinions of many other writers, the chief of whom will, for reasons above given, namely that it is they who have principally attended to the question, be Germans. I am fully aware that in this country a very considerable number of persons lean to some of these opinions, and I think I might venture to assert that I have the majority on my side, as far as regards ghosts. For it is beyond a doubt that many more are disposed to believe than to confess, and those who do confess are not few. The deep interest with which any narration of spiritual appearances bearing the stamp or apparent stamp of authenticity is listened to in every society is one proof that, though the fear of ridicule may suppress, it cannot extinguish that intuitive persuasion of which almost everyone is more or less conscious. I avow that in writing this book, I have a higher aim than merely to afford amusement. I wish to engage the earnest attention of my readers, because I am satisfied that the opinions I am about to advocate, seriously entertained, would produce very beneficial results. We are all educated in the belief of a future state, but how vague and ineffective this belief is with the majority of persons, we too well know. For although, as I have said above, the number of those who are what is called believers in ghosts and similar phenomena is very large, it is a belief that they allow to sit extremely lightly on their minds. Although they feel that the evidence from within and from without is too strong to be altogether set aside, they have never permitted themselves to weigh the significance of the facts. They are afraid of that bugbear, superstition, a title of opprobrium, which it is very convenient to attach to whatever we do not believe ourselves. They forget that nobody has a right to call any belief superstitious till he can prove that it is unfounded. Now, no one that lives can assert that the reappearance of the dead is impossible. All he has a right to say is that he does not believe it, and the interrogation that should immediately follow this declaration is, have you devoted your life to sifting all the evidence that has been adduced on the other side from the earliest periods of history and tradition? And even though the answer were in the affirmative, and that the investigation had been conscientiously pursued, it would still be a bold inquirer that would think himself entitled to say the question was no longer open. But the rashness and levity with which mankind make professions of believing and disbelieving are, all things considered, phenomena much more extraordinary than the most extraordinary ghost story that ever was related. The truth is that not one person in 1,000, in the proper sense of the word, believes anything. They only fancy they believe because they have never seriously considered the meaning of the word and all that it involves. That which the human mind cannot conceive of is apt to slip from its grasp like water from the hand. And life out of the flesh falls under this category. The observation of any phenomena, therefore, which enabled us to master the idea, must necessarily be extremely beneficial, and it must be remembered that one single, thoroughly well-established instance of the reappearance of a deceased person would not only have this effect, but that it would afford a demonstrative proof of the deepest of all our intuitions, namely, that a future life awaits us. Not to mention the modern Germans of eminence who have devoted themselves to this investigation, there have been men remarkable for intellect in all countries who have considered the subject worthy of inquiry. Among the rest, Plato, Pliny, and Lucian, and in our own country, that good old divine Dr. Henry Moore, Dr. Johnson, Addison, Isaac Taylor, and many others. It may be objected that the eternally quoted case of Nicolai, the bookseller at Berlin, and Dr. Ferriar's theory of apparitions had not then settled the question. But nobody doubts that Nicolai's was a case of disease, and he was well aware of it himself. As it appears to me, everybody so afflicted is. I was acquainted with a poor woman in Edinburgh who suffered from this malady, brought on, I believe, by drinking. But she was perfectly conscious of the nature of the illusions, and that temperance and a doctor were the proper exorcists to lay the spirits. With respect to Dr. Ferriar's book, a more shallow one was assuredly never allowed to settle any question, and his own theory cannot, without the most violent straining and the assistance of what he calls coincidences, meet even half the cases he himself adduces. That such a disease as he describes exists, nobody doubts, but I maintain that there are hundreds of cases on record for which the explanation does not suffice. And if they have been instances of spectral illusion, All that remains to be said is that a fundamental reconstruction of the theory on that subject is demanded. Laplace says, in his essay on probabilities, that any case, however apparently incredible, if it be a recurrent case, is as much entitled, under the laws of induction, to a fair valuation as if it had been more probable beforehand. Now, no one will deny that the case in question possesses this claim to investigation. Determined skeptics may indeed deny that there exists any well-authenticated instance of an apparition, but that, at present, can only be a mere matter of opinion, since many persons, as competent to judge as themselves, maintain the contrary. And in the meantime, I arraign their right to make this objection till they have qualified themselves to do so by a long course of patient and honest inquiry, always remembering that every instance of error or imposition discovered and adduced has no positive value whatever in the argument but as regards that single instance, though it may enforce upon us the necessity of strong evidence and careful investigation. With respect to the evidence, past and present, I must be allowed here to remark on the extreme difficulty of producing it, not to mention the acknowledged carelessness of observers and the alleged incapacity of persons to distinguish between reality and illusion. There is an exceeding shyness in most people who either have seen or fancied they have seen an apparition to speak of it at all, except to some intimate friend, so that one gets most of the stories second-hand. While even those who are less chary of their communications are imperative against their name and authority being given to the public. Besides this, there is a great tendency in most people, after the impression is over, to think they may have been deceived, and where there is no communication or other circumstance rendering this conviction impossible, it is not difficult to acquire it, or at least so much of it as leaves the case valueless. The seer is glad to find this refuge from the unpleasant feelings engendered, while surrounding friends, sometimes from genuine skepticism and sometimes from good nature, almost invariably lean to this explanation of the mystery. In consequence of these difficulties, and those attending the very nature of the phenomena, I freely admit that the facts I shall adduce, as they now stand, can have no scientific value. They cannot, in short, enter into the region of science at all, still less into that of philosophy. Whatever conclusions we may be led to form cannot be founded on pure induction. We must confine ourselves wholly within the region of opinion, if we venture beyond which we shall assuredly founder. In the beginning, all sciences have been but a collection of facts, afterward to be examined, compared, and weighed by intelligent minds. To the vulgar who do not see the universal law which governs the universe, everything out of the ordinary course of events is a prodigy. But to the enlightened mind, there are no prodigies, for it perceives that in both the moral and the physical world there is a chain of uninterrupted connection, and that the most strange and even apparently contradictory or supernatural fact or event will be found, on due investigation, to be strictly dependent on its antecedents. It is possible that there may be a link wanting, and that our investigations may, consequently, be fruitless. But the link is assuredly there, although our imperfect knowledge and limited vision cannot find it. And it is here the proper place to observe that, in undertaking to treat of the phenomena in question, I do not propose to consider them as supernatural. On the contrary, I am persuaded that the time will come when they will be reduced strictly within the bounds of science. It was the tendency of the last age to reject and deny everything they did not understand. I hope it is the growing tendency of the present one to examine what we do not understand. Equally disposed with our predecessors of the 18th century to reject the supernatural and to believe the order of nature inviolable, we are disposed to extend the bounds of nature and science till they comprise within their limits all the phenomena, ordinary and extraordinary, by which we are surrounded. Scarcely a month passes that we do not hear of some new and important discovery in science. It is a domain in which nothing is stable, and every year overthrows some of the hasty and premature theories of the preceding ones. And this will continue to be the case as long as scientific men occupy themselves each with his own subject without studying the great and primal truths, what the French call la vérité mère, which link the whole together. Meantime, there is a continual unsettling. Truth, if it do not emanate from an acknowledged authority, is generally rejected, and error, if it do, is as often accepted. While whoever disputes the received theory, whatever it be, we mean especially that adopted by the professors of colleges, does it at his peril. But there is a day, yet brooding in the bosom of time, when the sciences will no longer be isolated, when we shall no longer deny, but be able to account for, phenomena apparently prodigious, or have the modesty, if we cannot explain them, to admit that the difficulty arises solely from our own incapacity. The system of centralization in statistics seems to be of doubtful advantage, but a greater degree of centralization appears to be very much needed in the domain of science. Some improvement in this respect might do wonders, particularly if reinforced with a slight infusion of patience and humility into the minds of scientific men, together with the recollection that facts and phenomena which do not depend on our will must be waited for, that we must be at their command, for they will not be at ours. But to return once more to our own subject, if we do believe that a future life awaits us, there can be nothing more natural than the desire to obtain some information as to what manner of life that is to be, for which any one of us may, before this time tomorrow, have exchanged his present mode of being. That there does not exist a greater interest with regard to this question in the mind of man arises partly from the vague, intangible kind of belief he entertains of the fact, partly from his absorption in worldly affairs, and the hard and indigestible food upon which his clerical shepherds pasture him, for, under dogmatic theology, religion seems to have withered away to the mere husk of spiritualism, and partly also from the apparent impossibility of pursuing the inquiry to any purpose. As I said before, observation and experience can alone guide us in such an inquiry, for though most people have a more or less intuitive sense of their own immortality, intuition is silent as to the mode of it. And the question I am anxious here to discuss with my readers is whether we have any facts to observe or any experience from which, on this most interesting of all subjects, a conclusion may be drawn. Great as the difficulty is of producing evidence, it will, I think, be pretty generally admitted that, although each individual case as it stands alone may be comparatively valueless, the amount of recurrent cases forms a body of evidence that, on any other subject, would scarcely be rejected. And since, if the facts are accepted, they imperatively demand an explanation, for assuredly the present theory of spectral illusions cannot comprise them, our inquiry, let it terminate in whatever conclusion it may, cannot be useless or uninteresting. Various views of the phenomena in question may be taken. And although I shall offer my own opinions and the theories and opinions of others, I insist upon none. I do not write to dogmatize, but to suggest reflection and inquiry. The books of Dr. Ferriar, Dr. Hibbert, and Dr. Thatcher, the American, are all written to support one exclusive theory, and they only give such cases as serve to sustain it. They maintain that the whole phenomena are referable to nervous or sanguineous derangement, and are mere subjective illusions, and whatever instance cannot be covered by this theory, they reject as false, or treat as a case of extraordinary coincidence. In short, they arrange the facts to their theory, not their theory to the facts. Their books cannot, therefore, claim to be considered as anything more than essays on a special disease. They have no pretense whatever to the character of investigations. The question, consequently, remains as much an open one as before they treated it, while we have the advantage of their experience and information with regard to the peculiar malady that forms the subject of their works. On that subject it is not my intention to enter. It is strictly a medical one, and every information may be obtained respecting it in the above-named treatises, and others emanating from the faculty. The subjects I do intend to treat of are the various kinds of prophetic dreams, presentiments, second sight, and apparitions, and in short, all that class of phenomena which appears to throw some light on our physical nature, and on the probable state of the soul after death. In this discussion, I shall make free use of my German authorities, Drs. Kerner, Stilling, Werner, Eschenmeier, Ennemoser, Passavent, Schubert, von Meyer, and etc., and etc. And I here make a general acknowledgment to that effect, because it would embarrass my book too much to be constantly giving names and references, although when I quote their words literally, I shall make a point of doing so, and because also that as I have been both thinking and reading much on these subjects for considerable time past, I am in fact no longer in a condition to appropriate either to them or to myself each his own. This, however, is a matter of very little consequence, as I am not desirous of claiming any idea as mine that can be found elsewhere. It is enough for me if I succeed in making a tolerably clear exposition of the subject, and can induce other people to reflect upon it. End of Chapter 1.